Some wounds run deeper than flesh. They scar the very soul. For years, Alva endured the unthinkable, her humanity stripped away piece by piece until she forgot what it meant to be free. Left to die in the frozen woods like a broken animal, she had given up hope of ever seeing kindness again. That's when Erik Thorsson found her. This battle-worn Viking warrior saw something in her eyes that others had missed, a spark that refused to die. He broke her chains, but healing her spirit would take much longer. As they slowly build trust in a world that shows little mercy, danger from her past returns. Her former captors want their property back, and they'll stop at nothing to reclaim her. But will Alva find the strength to fight for her freedom, or will the scars of her past keep her prisoner forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like memories that refused to fade, wrapping itself around the weathered stones of Eriksfjord village as the first light of dawn crept across the water. Erik Thorsson stood at the edge of his modest longhouse, watching the familiar dance of fog and sunlight that had greeted him for the past 3 years since he'd returned from the eastern campaigns. His calloused hands wrapped around a steaming cup of ale, the warmth seeping through his fingers, a simple pleasure he'd learned to cherish after too many cold mornings spent gripping sword hilts instead. At 38, Erik bore the marks of a man who had seen the world's harsh edges and lived to tell the tale. His beard, once golden like summer wheat, now carried threads of silver that caught the morning light. Scars traced intricate patterns across his forearms, some from battles he remembered with pride, others from conflicts he wished he could forget. The deep line that ran from his left temple to his jaw served as a permanent reminder of why he'd chosen to lay down his sword and take up the plough. The village of Eriksfjord had welcomed him home with the measured respect due a warrior who had served his jarl faithfully. They knew his reputation. Erik the Fierce, they had called him in the war camps, the man who could read the tide of battle like a shepherd reads the sky for storms. But the Erik who had returned 3 years ago was different from the young man who had sailed east with dreams of glory. This Erik moved with deliberate care, spoke in measured tones, and seemed to find more satisfaction in the growth of barley than in the taking of lives. His modest farmstead sat on the periphery of the village, where the cultivated fields gave way to the wild forest. It was a choice that spoke volumes about his desire for solitude, close enough to the community for trade and occasional fellowship, far enough away to find the peace that had eluded him during his years of warfare. The longhouse itself was well built but unadorned, functional rather than grand. No weapons hung from the walls, save for a simple hunting knife, and an axe used more for splitting wood than splitting skulls. Behind the house, neat rows of barley and oats stretched toward the tree line, evidence of Erik's dedication to his new life. His hands, once skilled only in the art of war, had learned to coax life from the reluctant northern soil. Each successful harvest felt like a small victory over his own violent past. Proof that something could grow from hands that had known too much destruction. The village itself was typical of the region, a collection of sturdy longhouses arranged around a central hall where the community gathered for important decisions and seasonal celebrations. Smoke rose from morning fires as families began their daily routines. Children's laughter echoed from the training yard, where boys learned to handle wooden swords, their play a distant echo of the serious business of warfare that would likely claim some of them in years to come. Erik knew most of the villagers by name, though he kept his relationships cordial rather than close. There was Bjorn the blacksmith, whose skilled hands could forge both tools and weapons with equal mastery. His wife Astrid ran the household with the efficiency of a ship's captain, their 3 sons already showing promise with blade and hammer. Old Gunnar, the village storyteller, spent his evenings weaving tales of gods and heroes for wide-eyed children. His voice, carrying the weight of decades, spent memorizing the oral traditions of their people. The village thrived on trade and farming. with occasional fishing expeditions to supplement their stores. It was a stable community, far enough from major trade routes to avoid most of the violence that plagued other settlements, yet prosperous enough to maintain its independence. The Jarl, Olaf Ironside, ruled fairly from his hall 2 days' ride to the south, content to let villages like Eriksfjord manage their own affairs as long as the taxes were paid, and able-bodied men answered the call when warfare demanded it. Erik had deliberately chosen this quiet existence. The Eastern campaigns had shown him enough of the world's cruelty. Cities burned, families torn apart, children orphaned in the name of glory and gold. He had been good at warfare, perhaps too good. His tactical mind could read terrain and enemy movements with an almost supernatural clarity, and his sword arm had never failed him when death came calling. But each victory had left him feeling emptier, each conquered settlement a weight on his soul, rather than a trophy to be celebrated. The decision to return home had not been easy. His reputation could have opened doors to greater glory, perhaps even a place among the Jarl's permanent retinue. But the morning after the siege of Kiev, as he walked among the smoldering ruins and listened to the weeping of survivors, something inside him had simply broken. Not in the way that makes a man useless. He was far too disciplined for that. But in the way that makes a man question whether strength should always be measured by one's capacity for destruction. So he had taken his share of the plunder, bid farewell to his shield brothers, and sailed home to Eriksfjord. The transition had been difficult at first. His hands, accustomed to the weight of sword and shield, felt clumsy holding farming tools. His mind, trained to constant vigilance for threats, struggled to find peace in the simple rhythms of agricultural life. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by the faces of men he had killed and the sounds of battles he could never forget. But gradually, the land had worked its own form of healing. There was something profoundly satisfying about planting seeds in spring and watching them grow throughout the summer. The cycle of seasons provided a natural rhythm that warfare had always disrupted. Each harvest was a small act of creation rather than destruction, each successful crop of victory measured not in blood spilled, but in lives sustained. The villagers had accepted his transformation with the practical wisdom of people who understood that warriors, like tools, sometimes needed to be repurposed when their original function no longer served. They valued his counsel when disputes arose, respected his military experience when questions of defense were discussed, but they also appreciated his commitment to becoming something more than just a weapon waiting to be wielded. Erik's daily routine had become a form of meditation. He rose before dawn, checked his livestock, and spent the early morning hours tending to whatever tasks the season demanded. The physical labor helped quiet his mind, while the solitude allowed him to process the gradual healing that time and honest work were slowly accomplishing. He found himself sleeping better, dreaming less of blood and more of growing things. Yet for all his success in building this new life, Erik was aware of a persistent emptiness that even the most satisfying harvest could not fill. He had found peace, but not purpose beyond his own healing. His life was good, stable, and productive, but it felt somehow incomplete. He told himself this was simply the price of choosing safety over adventure, contentment over glory. But in his quieter moments, he wondered if he was meant for something more than this comfortable isolation. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full beauty of the fjord. Soon, he would need to check his traps in the forest, gather deadfall for winter fuel, and begin preparing his fields for the approaching harvest season. It was a good life, he reminded himself, as he finished his ale and prepared to begin another peaceful day. He had no way of knowing that before the sun set again, everything would change. The trapline that morning yielded nothing but disappointment, 3 empty snares, and signs that wolves had been working the area, likely scaring off the smaller game Erik depended on to supplement his stores. He moved deeper into the forest than usual, following an old hunter's path that wound between ancient pines, whose trunks were so thick that 3 men couldn't circle them with outstretched arms. The deeper woods held a different quality of silence, heavy and expectant, broken only by the occasional crack of settling branches and the distant call of ravens. Erik's trained senses, dulled by 3 years of peaceful farming, but never entirely dormant, began to prickle with unease. Something was wrong here, not the immediate danger that had once sent him diving for cover, but something more subtle, like the feeling of being watched by unfriendly eyes. He found the first sign of trouble near a small clearing where an old, lightning-struck oak stood sentinel over a scatter of moss-covered stones. Fresh horse droppings, still steaming in the cool morning air, marked the passage of riders who had no business being this deep in the forest. Erik knelt beside the evidence, his farmer's hands automatically reverting to the careful examination techniques that had kept him alive through a dozen campaigns. 3 horses, possibly 4, heavily laden, judging by the depth of the hoofprints in the soft earth. They had passed this way within the last few hours, moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of travelers. The direction troubled him most. They were heading away from the village, deeper into the wilderness, where only hunters and outlaws had reason to venture. Erik straightened, his hand unconsciously moving to where his sword hilt should have been, before remembering that he carried only his hunting knife. Old habits died hard, especially when every instinct he possessed was suddenly screaming that danger lurked nearby. He could turn back now, return to his peaceful farm and pretend he had seen nothing. Whatever business these riders had in the deep woods was likely none of his concern. But curiosity had always been both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. The same impulse that had made him an excellent scout and strategist now compelled him to follow the trail, if only far enough to satisfy himself that these strangers posed no threat to Eriksfjord. The trail led downhill toward a marshy depression where a small stream wound its way between stands of birch and willow. The sound of running water would mask the approach of anyone following, Erik realized, either by accident or design. His movements became more cautious, drawing on skills he had hoped never to need again. It was the smell that reached him first, a sickly, sweet odor that any veteran would recognize immediately. Death, and not the clean death of battle, but something fouler, something that spoke of cruelty and deliberate suffering. Erik's stomach clenched as unwelcome memories surfaced, images of burned villages and the aftermath of raids where mercy had been as scarce as clean water. He approached the final ridge with the silent care of a man who had learned that carelessness killed, dropping to his belly and crawling the last few yards until he could peer down into the marshy clearing below. What he saw there drove the breath from his lungs and sent his hand instinctively to his knife hilt. 2 bodies lay crumpled near the stream's edge, men by their size and clothing, though death and the attentions of scavengers had already begun their grim work. But it was the 3rd figure that captured Erik's horrified attention and held it like a vice around his heart. A woman, chained to a massive iron stake driven deep into the marshy ground. Even from his elevated position, Erik could see that she was barely alive, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, her clothes little more than blood-stained rags. The chains that bound her were not the simple rope or leather restraints a reasonable captor might use, but heavy iron links better suited to restraining a dangerous animal. She had been left to die, that much was clear. But the deliberate cruelty of it, chaining her like a beast and leaving her to suffer while exposure and starvation did their slow work, spoke of a malice that made Erik's warrior's soul burn with rage. This was not the clean brutality of warfare, but something far more vicious and personal. For a long moment, Erik remained frozen on the ridge, torn between the cautious farmer he had become and the warrior he had tried to leave behind. The smart thing would be to retreat, gather help from the village, approach this with proper planning and sufficient force. But even as his rational mind catalogued the wisdom of this approach, his eyes remained fixed on the woman's still form, and he knew with cold certainty that she didn't have time for careful planning. The descent into the clearing felt like falling backward through time, each step returning him to the man he had been before peace and farming had softened his edges. His hunting knife appeared in his hand without conscious thought, his movements becoming fluid and predatory as he approached the grisly scene. The dead men bore the marks of violent ends, one with his throat open to the sky, the other with what looked like multiple stab wounds in his back. Their weapons were gone, their purses cut away, but something about the scene nagged at Erik's tactical mind. These men had not died fighting each other, nor had they been killed by bandits looking for easy profit, but those questions would have to wait. The woman was his immediate concern, and as he drew closer he could see the slow rise and fall of her chest that marked the difference between the nearly dead and the truly departed. She was alive, barely, but alive nonetheless. Erik knelt beside her, his experienced eye cataloguing injuries with the dispassionate efficiency that had made him valuable in the aftermath of battles. Exposure, dehydration, multiple cuts and bruises that spoke of deliberate abuse. The chains that bound her were locked with a mechanism he didn't recognize, but the iron itself was beginning to rust from exposure to the marsh's moisture. Her face was turned away from him, long dark hair matted with mud and worse things. But when his shadow fell across her, she stirred slightly. The movement was so small, he almost missed it, just a barely perceptible tensing of muscles that suggested consciousness, however dim. "Easy," Erik said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here to help." The woman's head turned toward him with agonizing slowness, and Erik found himself looking into eyes that stopped his heart for a moment. Blue as winter ice, but burning with something that neither chains nor cruelty had been able to extinguish. In those eyes, he saw not the broken spirit of a victim, but the banked fires of a survivor who had endured the unendurable and somehow retained her essential self. "My name is Erik," he continued, keeping his voice calm and steady while his mind raced through the practical problems of freeing her from the chains. "Can you hear me?" The slightest nod, so small another man might have missed it entirely. "I'm going to get you out of these chains," Erik promised, already examining the rusted metal for weak points. "And then we're going to get you somewhere safe." As he spoke, Erik knew that his quiet life in Eriksfjord had just come to an end. Whatever had brought this woman to this terrible place, whoever had done this to her, the echoes of that violence would not stop here. But looking into those defiant blue eyes, he also knew that he couldn't walk away. Some things were more important than peace, and some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. The chains would break, he decided grimly. One way or another, the chains would break. Breaking the chains proved more challenging than Erik had anticipated. The rust that marked years of exposure had actually strengthened the metal in some places while weakening it in others, creating an unpredictable pattern of strength and vulnerability. Using a heavy stone as a makeshift hammer, he worked methodically at the weakest links, each blow echoing across the marsh like a death knell for his former peaceful existence. The woman, he still didn't know her name, watched his efforts with those penetrating blue eyes, saying nothing but tracking his every movement with an intensity that spoke of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest gestures. When he paused to rest his aching arm, she spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the unmistakable accent of the eastern lands. "You should leave me." The words hit Erik harder than any physical blow could have. Not because of their content. He had expected resistance, perhaps even hostility born of trauma, but because of the absolute conviction with which she spoke them. This was not the plea of someone seeking to spare a rescuer from danger, but the statement of someone who had moved beyond hope. "That's not going to happen," Erik replied, resuming his assault on the chains with renewed determination. "I've seen enough abandoned souls in my lifetime. You won't be another?" Something flickered in her eyes at his words, surprise, perhaps, or the faintest stirring of something that might once have been hope. But she said nothing more, simply continued her silent observation as he worked. The first chain parted with a sharp crack that sent Erik's hands flying backward. Knuckles scraped raw from contact with the rough stone. The woman's left arm was free, and immediately she began working it in small, careful circles, testing the return of circulation to limbs that had been bound too long. Erik noticed that even this simple movement was controlled, deliberate, the actions of someone who had learned to hide pain as a matter of survival. "What's your name?" he asked as he positioned himself to attack the second chain. "Alva," she said after a long pause, as if the word had to travel a great distance to reach her lips. "Alva," Erik repeated, testing the sound of it. "I'm going to get you home, Alva. Where is home for you?" The question seemed to cause her physical pain. Her free hand clenched into a fist, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a flatness that spoke of doors, deliberately closed. "There is no home." "There hasn't been for a very long time." Erik paused in his work, struck by the finality in her tone. In his years of warfare, he had encountered many displaced people, refugees fleeing violence, slaves taken in raids, survivors of burned settlements seeking new places to rebuild their lives. But this was different. Alva spoke not of a home lost to circumstances, but of the very concept of home having been destroyed within her. "Then we'll figure something else out," he said simply, returning to his attack on the chains. One problem at a time. The second chain proved more stubborn than the first, its links somehow fused by the combination of rust and repeated stress. Erik was beginning to worry that he would need proper tools, a blacksmith's hammer at minimum, perhaps even a forge to heat the metal, when Alva spoke again. "The third link from the stake," she said quietly. "It's cracked. I felt it give when they chained me." Erik examined the spot she indicated and found she was right. A hairline fracture ran along one side of the link, nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. Two well-placed blows opened it completely, and suddenly Alva was free of the stake that had held her prisoner. But freedom from the stake was not freedom from the chains themselves. The heavy metal still encircled her wrists and ankles, connected by lengths that would allow her to walk, but never to run. Erik realized with growing anger that these restraints had been designed for long-term captivity, built to permit just enough mobility to keep the prisoner alive while ensuring they could never truly escape. "Can you stand?" he asked, offering his hand to help her rise. Alva looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, and Erik could see the internal struggle playing out behind her eyes. Trust was clearly a luxury she could no longer afford. Yet her situation demanded that she accept help from this stranger who had appeared in her darkest hour. Finally, she placed her hand in his, tentatively ready to pull away at the first sign of threat. Her grip was stronger than he had expected, the calluses on her palms speaking of hard labor and harder survival. When she stood, Erik was surprised by her height. She came nearly to his shoulder, tall for a woman of any land. But it was her bearing that impressed him most. Despite everything she had endured, despite the chains that still bound her, Alva stood straight and met his eyes directly. Whatever had been done to her body, her spirit remained unbroken. "We need to leave this place," Erik said, scanning the clearing one more time. "Whoever did this might return." "They won't return," Alva said with certainty. "They think I'm dead." That was the point. The casual way she spoke of being left for dead chilled Erik more than the morning air. How long had she been chained here? How many days had she spent knowing that death was coming slowly, deliberately, as a final act of cruelty from whoever had held her captive? "Who were they?" he asked, as they began moving away from the clearing, Alva's chain-shortened steps forcing them to move slowly. "Slavers," she replied without elaboration. Erik nodded grimly. He had encountered slave traders in the eastern lands, men who dealt in human misery with the casual efficiency of merchants selling grain or cloth. They were pragmatic in their cruelty, keeping their merchandise alive and functional for as long as it served their purposes. But when a slave became more trouble than profit, or when an example needed to be made for others, they could be imaginatively vicious in their disposal methods. The journey back to his farm would take most of the day, even by the most direct route. With Alva's mobility limited by the chains, they would need to move carefully and rest frequently. More importantly, they would need to avoid the main paths where curious villagers might spot them and ask questions Erik wasn't ready to answer. As they made their slow progress through the forest, Erik found himself stealing glances at his unexpected companion. Alva moved with careful economy, never wasting motion, but never hurrying either. She seemed to be testing her body's capabilities, relearning what was possible after whatever ordeal she had endured. Her silence was not uncomfortable but thoughtful, the quiet of someone processing a sudden and dramatic change in circumstances. When they paused to rest beside a small stream, Erik finally voiced the question that had been growing in his mind since they left the clearing. "How long were you chained there?" Alva looked up from cupping water in her hands. The first sustenance she had allowed herself since he found her. "Long enough to stop counting days," she said. The sun had climbed, well past its midday peak by the time Erik's longhouse came into view through the trees. What should have been a 2-hour walk had stretched into most of the day, with frequent stops to allow Alva to rest and adjust to movement after what must have been weeks of immobility. During those rest periods, Erik had tried to engage her in conversation, hoping to learn more about her situation. But Alva volunteered little beyond basic responses to direct questions. She was from the eastern lands, as her accent had suggested. She had been a slave for some years. She wouldn't be more specific than that. The men who had chained her in the marsh were traders who specialized in difficult merchandise, slaves who had proven troublesome or unprofitable. She spoke of these facts with the same emotional detachment others might use to discuss the weather, and Erik began to understand that this distance was not callousness, but survival. As they approached his farm, Erik felt a familiar weight settling in his chest, the burden of responsibility for another human life, something he had hoped never to carry again. His longhouse, which had seemed perfectly adequate for a solitary man seeking peace, suddenly felt woefully unprepared for a guest, especially one who would require care, protection, and time to heal from trauma he could only begin to imagine. "This is your home?" Alva asked, speaking for the first time in nearly an hour. "It is," Erik replied, trying to see his modest farm through her eyes. The longhouse was well built but simple, surrounded by neat fields and a few outbuildings. Smoke rose from the central hearth, indicating that the banked coals from morning were still alive and could be coaxed back to flame. "It's not much, but it's peaceful." Alva nodded but said nothing more. Erik wondered what she was thinking, whether the sight of a normal, functional home brought comfort or pain to someone who had claimed to have no home of her own. The first challenge became apparent as soon as they reached the door. The entrance to Erik's longhouse was elevated slightly above ground level, with 3 stone steps leading up to the threshold. For a man with unencumbered legs, it was barely noticeable. For someone whose ankles were connected by a short length of chain, it might as well have been a mountain. Alva studied the steps for a moment, then sat down heavily on the lowest stone. "I can't," she said simply. Erik looked at the chains around her ankles, then back at her face. In her expression he saw not defeat, but practical assessment of an impossible situation. She had learned to recognize her limitations and accept them without wasting energy on futile struggles. "Yes, you can," Erik said, "but you'll need help." Before she could protest, he scooped her up in his arms, carrying her easily up the steps and through the doorway. For a moment, Alva went rigid with what might have been fear or simply the instinctive reaction of someone who had learned that unexpected contact usually meant pain. But as Erik set her down gently just inside the entrance, she relaxed slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. The interior of Erik's longhouse reflected its owner's practical nature. Clean but unadorned, functional rather than comfortable. A central fire pit dominated the main room, surrounded by simple wooden furniture that Erik had built himself. Sleeping furs were arranged along one wall, while the opposite side held his few possessions, tools, spare clothing, a small collection of books he had acquired during his travels. Alva stood in the center of the room, taking in her surroundings with the same careful attention she had shown throughout their journey. Erik realized she was cataloging exits, potential weapons, hiding places, the automatic assessment of someone who had learned that survival depended on understanding one's environment completely. "You should sit," Erik said, indicating a wooden chair near the fire pit. "Rest while I get these chains off you. You can remove them?" There was something in her voice that might have been hope, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "I think so. I've proper tools here, hammer, chisel, file. It might take some time, but we'll get them off." Erik's small forge was located in a separate outbuilding, but he kept basic metalworking tools in the house for minor repairs. He gathered what he needed, while Alva settled herself by the fire, extending her chained hands toward the warmth with a sigh that spoke of deep, bone-level exhaustion. Working on the chains in the better light of his home, Erik could see details that had been obscured in the forest. The metal was of good quality, expertly forged. These were not temporary restraints, but permanent fixtures designed to last for years. The locks were complex mechanisms that would require either the proper keys or significant skill to defeat. But the hinges where the cuffs closed were accessible, and given time and patience, they could be broken. "This might hurt," Erik warned as he positioned his smallest chisel against the first hinge pin. "Pain passes," Alva replied. "Chains are forever." The work was delicate and slow. Erik had to be careful not to injure Alva's wrists while applying enough force to break the metal. Each blow of the hammer rang through the longhouse like a bell, marking the gradual destruction of symbols that had defined Alva's existence for far too long. As he worked, Erik found himself studying Alva's hands. They told a story of their own, calloused from hard labor, scarred from injuries both deliberate and accidental, but also graceful in their movements. These were the hands of someone who had known gentler times before slavery claimed her, someone who remembered what it felt like to create rather than merely endure. "How long since you've slept in a real bed?" Erik asked during a pause in his work. Alva considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure what you mean by real bed," she said finally. The casual honesty of her response hit Erik like a physical blow. How long had she been property rather than a person? How many years had passed since she had experienced the simple human dignity of clean bedding and a safe place to rest? The first cuff came free with a sharp crack that made them both jump. Alva stared at her freed wrist as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. She flexed her fingers experimentally, then ran them along her wrist where the metal had left permanent indentations in her skin. "One down," Erik said, moving to position his tools against the second cuff. 3 to go, but as he worked, a troubling thought began to grow in his mind. Freeing Alva from her chains was the easy part. Metal could be broken, locks could be picked, physical restraints could be overcome with the right tools and enough determination. The harder question was, what came next? Where could she go? What kind of life was possible for someone who had been deliberately erased from the world of free people? And perhaps, most importantly, what would happen when her former captors discovered that their discarded property had not died as intended? 3 days passed before all the chains were finally removed. Erik had worked carefully, methodically, taking breaks when his hands cramped or when he sensed that Alva needed time to process each small step toward freedom. With each fallen shackle, she seemed to grow slightly taller, as if some invisible weight was being lifted along with the metal restraints. But freedom from chains, Erik was learning, did not automatically translate to freedom of spirit. Alva moved through his longhouse like a ghost, touching nothing without permission, eating only when explicitly offered food, and sleeping curled in the corner farthest from the door, a position that offered the best view of all entrances while making her as small a target as possible. On the 4th morning, Erik woke to find her standing motionless by the window, staring out at the forest with an intensity that made his warrior instincts prickle with unease. "What is it?" he asked, joining her at the window. "They're coming," she said simply. Erik scanned the tree line but saw nothing unusual. No movement, No signs of disturbance. No indication that anything was amiss. "Who's coming? How do you know?" "I always know," Alva replied with the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything. "It's how I stayed alive." Before Erik could ask for clarification, he heard it, the distant sound of horses moving through the forest, still far away but definitely approaching. His enhanced hearing, sharpened by years of warfare, confirmed what Alva's more finely tuned senses had already detected. Multiple riders, moving with purpose rather than casual travel. "How many?" he asked. "4, maybe 5. "They've been tracking us since yesterday, staying far enough back to avoid detection." Alva turned from the window to face him. "You should let them take me. Tell them you found me, and were planning to return me. They might let you live." The casual way she suggested her own recapture, as if it were a reasonable solution to a simple problem, sparked something hot and dangerous in Erik's chest. "That's not going to happen. You don't understand what they're capable of." "I understand exactly what they're capable of," Erik interrupted, his voice carrying an edge that had been absent for 3 years. "I've seen slave traders before, Alva. I've seen what they do to people. But I've also seen what happens when they meet someone who knows how to fight back." Something flickered in Alva's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest stirring of hope. But it was quickly suppressed. "You're one man. They are many, and they know this business better than you might think." Erik moved away from the window, his mind already shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him alive through dozens of battles. "Tell me about them. Everything you know, numbers, weapons, how they operate." "Why?" Alva asked, though she followed him as he began gathering items from around the longhouse. "Because I'm not letting them take you back," Erik said, pulling his old war chest from beneath his sleeping furs. "And if they want to try, they're going to discover that this peaceful farmer has some skills they weren't expecting." The chest hadn't been opened in 3 years, but the lock still responded to Erik's touch, as if it had been yesterday. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the tools of his former trade. Not just weapons, but the complete kit of a professional warrior: armor, siege tools, and items whose purposes would not be immediately obvious to casual observers. Alva watched in fascination as Erik transformed before her eyes. The gentle farmer, who had spent days patiently freeing her from her chains, was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, more focused, radiating the quiet confidence of a man who had faced death and emerged victorious. When he stood, now wearing the leather armor that had protected him through the Eastern campaigns, he looked like a completely different person. "Now," Erik said, checking the edge on a blade that gleamed despite years of storage. "Tell me about our visitors." Alva hesitated for a moment, clearly struggling with ingrained habits of silence and submission. But something in Erik's transformed presence seemed to reach past her conditioning to the person she had been before slavery claimed her. "Their leader is called Grim," she began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "He specializes in problem slaves, the ones who fight back, who try to escape, who cause trouble for other traders. He has methods for breaking spirits that remain unbroken." "How many men does he usually travel with?" 4 or 5, depending on the job. "All experienced fighters, all completely loyal to him. They're well armed and they know these forests. This isn't their first time operating in this region." Erik nodded, processing this information with the analytical mind that had made him valuable to his former commanders. 5 men, experienced but probably not true warriors, in the sense he understood the term. Slave traders relied more on intimidation and the advantage of numbers than on genuine combat skill. Still, they would be dangerous, especially on ground they knew well. "What does Grim look like?" Erik asked, beginning to formulate a plan. Tall, thin, with a scar that runs from his left ear to his mouth. He carries a curved sword from the eastern lands and a whip that he uses for more than just controlling slaves. Alva's voice remained steady, but Erik could see the effort it cost her to speak of the man who had clearly been responsible for significant portions of her suffering. And the others. 2 brothers, Ulf and Egil. They're younger, crueler, and stupider than Grim. They enjoy causing pain for its own sake, not just as a means to an end. The fourth man is called Hakon. He's older, more careful. He handles the business side. Negotiations, sales, transport arrangements. You said 4 or 5. Who's the fifth? Alva was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes Grim brings a tracker, a man who can follow trails that others would miss, who knows the forests and mountains better than the animals that live there. If he's with them. She didn't finish the sentence. But Erik understood the implication. Well, Erik said, settling his old war belt around his waist with movements that spoke of long practice. I suppose we'll find out soon enough. He moved to the window again, and this time he could see them, distant figures moving between the trees. Still perhaps an hour away, but definitely heading in their direction. 4 riders, as Alva had predicted, with what might be a 5th figure hanging back in the deeper forest. There's still time for you to run, Alva said quietly. I can walk out to meet them, tell them I escaped on my own, and you had nothing to do with it. Erik turned to look at her. This woman who had endured years of brutality and degradation, yet still tried to protect a stranger who had shown her a few days of kindness. In that moment, he understood that whatever happened in the next few hours, he had already won the only victory that truly mattered. He had remembered what it felt like to fight for something worth defending. Alva, he said gently, I spent 3 years trying to forget who I used to be. But some things are more important than peace, and some people are worth fighting for. Today, you're going to see what Erik the Fierce was like before he became Erik the Farmer. The riders were close enough now that Erik could make out individual details, the gleam of weapons, the purposeful way they moved, the confidence of men who had never encountered serious resistance. They were about to learn that assumptions could be fatal, and that peaceful farmers sometimes had very interesting pasts. Erik's longhouse had been designed by a man who understood the value of defensive positions, though few would have recognized the tactical advantages hidden within its seemingly simple construction. The elevated entrance provided clear sightlines in all directions, while offering the defender higher ground. The thick timber walls would stop most projectiles, and the single door created a natural choke point that would force attackers to approach in single file. But more importantly, Erik had spent 3 years learning every tree, every rock, every stream within an hour's ride of his home. What had begun as a farmer's practical knowledge of his land was now revealing itself to be a detailed intelligence map of the battlefield he had unknowingly been preparing. I need you to listen carefully, Erik said to Alva as he made final preparations for the confrontation. There's a root cellar beneath the sleeping area. You can access it through a trapdoor hidden under the large fir. If things go badly, hide there and don't come out until you're certain it's safe. Alva watched him with eyes that had seen too much violence to harbor any illusions about what was coming. You're planning to fight all of them yourself. I'm planning to end this before it becomes a fight, Erik replied, checking the balance on a throwing axe that had served him well in the Eastern campaigns. But if that fails, yes, I'll fight them all myself if necessary. That's madness. No, Erik said, meeting her gaze directly. That's what I was trained for. What I was very, very good at. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Erik could now hear voices, men calling to each other as they coordinated their approach. Professional voices, calm and confident. They had done this many times before, and expected this time to be no different. Through the window, Erik caught his first clear glimpse of Grim, and he understood immediately why Alva had spoken of the man with such carefully controlled fear. Even at a distance, the slave trader radiated a particular kind of menace, not the hot anger of a common brute, but the cold calculation of someone who had turned cruelty into an art form. His scarred face was set in an expression of mild interest, as if he were approaching a mildly interesting business transaction rather than a potentially violent confrontation. The 2 younger men, the brothers Ulf and Egil, flanked him on either side, their eager grins suggesting they hoped for resistance rather than compliance. They rode with the loose confidence of men who had never encountered an enemy they couldn't overcome through superior numbers and brutality. The fourth man, presumably Hakon, hung back slightly, his attention focused more on the surrounding forest than on the longhouse ahead. This one was more careful, Erik noted, and therefore more dangerous. He would be watching for ambushes, escape routes, and complications that the others might miss. As for the fifth figure, the tracker Alva had mentioned, Erik still couldn't spot him clearly. But he had the distinct feeling of being observed from multiple directions simultaneously. Wherever the man was positioned, he had chosen his spot well. "Farmer!" Grim's voice carried easily across the clearing, pitched to sound friendly and reasonable. "We've come to retrieve some lost property. No need for trouble between us." Erik stepped out of his longhouse, deliberately moving with the slightly clumsy gait of a man unaccustomed to wearing armor. Let them think he was playing at being a warrior rather than revealing himself as one. The element of surprise would be his greatest advantage. "Good day to you, travelers," Erik called back, injecting just the right note of nervous uncertainty into his voice. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about lost property." Grim rode closer, his smile never wavering, even as his eyes catalogued every detail of Erik's appearance and equipment. "Of course you don't, friend. These things can be confusing for honest folk. But we have reason to believe that one of our slaves may have wandered onto your land. A woman, dark hair, probably injured. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" The casual way Grim referred to Alva as property, rather than a person, made Erik's hand itch for his sword hilt, but he maintained his facade of nervous cooperation. "I did find someone in the forest 3 days ago. Badly hurt, chained up like an animal. Naturally, I helped her." "Naturally," Grim agreed, his smile growing wider. "That speaks well of your character. And where is she now?" "Safe," Erik said simply. Something shifted in Grim's expression, a subtle hardening around the eyes that suggested the polite phase of their conversation was drawing to a close. "I'm afraid you don't understand the situation, farmer. That woman is legally purchased property, properly documented and marked. By harboring her, you've technically committed theft. But I'm willing to overlook that if you simply return what belongs to me." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Erik replied, allowing a note of steel to enter his voice. "She's a free woman under my protection." Grim's laugh was like winter wind through bare branches, cold and without warmth. "Your protection? Look around you, farmer. Count the odds. Do you really think one man with a sword can stand against 4 seasoned fighters?" "I think," Erik said, straightening to his full height and letting his farmer's mask slip away entirely, "that you should have asked better questions before you rode onto my land." The change in Erik's bearing was subtle but unmistakable. Where a nervous farmer had stood moments before, there was now a man who moved with the fluid precision of a professional killer. His hand rested lightly on his sword hilt, not threatening but ready, and his eyes held the flat, measuring look of someone calculating the most efficient ways to end multiple lives. Grim's smile faltered slightly as he began to realize that his simple property recovery mission might be more complicated than anticipated. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice losing some of its casual confidence. "My name is Erik Thorsson," Erik replied, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Some people used to call me Erik the Fierce, and you gentlemen have just made the mistake of threatening someone under my protection." The name struck home like a physical blow. Even Alva, watching from the window, could see the sudden tension that rippled through the mounted men. Erik the Fierce was not unknown in the eastern lands. Stories of his tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency had traveled far from the battlefields where he had earned his reputation. "That's impossible," Ulf said, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Erik the Fierce disappeared years ago. I retired," Erik said calmly. "I was enjoying my retirement until you decided to come calling." Grim recovered his composure with visible effort, though his hand had moved to rest on his weapon. "Reputation or no reputation, you're still 1 man against 4. Mathematics doesn't lie. No, Erik agreed, it doesn't, but you're making a fundamental error in your calculations. What error is that? Erik's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. Oh, you're assuming this is going to be a fair fight. The throwing axe left Erik's hand with blinding speed, covering the distance to Grim in the space between one heartbeat and the next. But instead of striking the slave trader, it buried itself in the tree directly behind him, a clear demonstration of accuracy and a warning of what could have happened. That was your only warning, Erik said into the sudden silence. Leave my land now and never return. Stay, and I'll show you why they called me the Fierce. For a moment the clearing hung, suspended in perfect tension, balanced on the knife's edge between violence and wisdom. Then Grim's face twisted into an ugly snarl, and Erik knew that talking was finished. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that spoke of men who had executed similar operations many times before. Ulf and Egil spurred their horses forward in a frontal charge, while Håkon circled to Erik's left flank, seeking to trap him in a crossfire. It was a sound, tactical approach that would have overwhelmed most opponents through sheer momentum and superior positioning, but Erik was not most opponents. Instead of retreating toward his longhouse as they expected, he moved forward to meet their charge, selecting Ulf as his primary target with the cold calculation of a man who understood that the first few seconds of combat determined everything that followed. The younger brother's eager grin transformed into shock as Erik's sword appeared in his hand with liquid smoothness, the blade catching sunlight as it traced a silver arc through the air. Ulf's cry of pain echoed across the clearing as Erik's blade opened a long gash across his sword arm, sending his weapon spinning away into the grass. The wounded man clutched his arm and wheeled his horse away, suddenly more interested in survival than glory. Egil's attack met a similar fate, though Erik's counter was more brutal. A pommel strike to the temple that sent the second brother tumbling from his saddle to lie motionless in the dirt. 2 opponents neutralized in as many heartbeats, their coordinated attack reduced to chaos by the simple expedient of superior skill and absolute commitment to violence. Håkon proved more challenging. The older fighter had anticipated that his companions might fail and positioned himself accordingly, using their distraction to maneuver for a killing stroke at Erik's back. His blade whistled through the air where Erik's head had been an instant before, the near miss close enough to part his hair. But as Erik spun to face this new threat, something extraordinary happened. A stone, thrown with remarkable accuracy, struck Håkon's sword hand just as he prepared to strike again. The weapon flew from nerveless fingers as the fighter cursed and looked around wildly for the source of the unexpected attack. Alva stood in the doorway of the longhouse, another stone already in her hand, her eyes blazing with something Erik had never seen there before, not just defiance, but active participation in her own defense. The woman, who had been too broken to climb 3 steps unaided, was now fighting alongside him, turning a desperate last stand into something approaching an even contest. You were supposed to hide, Erik called to her as he pressed his attack against the now disarmed Håkon. I was never very good at following orders, Alva replied, her second stone catching Ulf in the shoulder as he tried to retrieve his fallen sword. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. Even as Erik drove Håkon back with a series of lightning-fast attacks, even as Alva's stones kept the wounded brothers at bay, Grim remained untouched and apparently unconcerned by the defeat of his companions. He sat his horse calmly, watching the melee with the detached interest of someone observing an entertainment rather than a life-or-death struggle. Very impressive, Grim called out as Erik finally brought Håkon down with a thrust that punched through leather armor to find the flesh beneath. You're everything the stories claimed, Erik the Fierce, but you're missing something important. Erik turned to face the slave trader, his blade red with the blood of fallen enemies, his chest heaving from the exertion of combat. What's that? Grim's smile was cold as winter ice. You're not the only one with a reputation. The words struck Erik like a physical blow as understanding flooded through him. The easy confidence, the willingness to approach a known warrior with only 4 companions. The casual way Grim had watched his men fall without showing concern. It all made sense now. "You're not just a slave trader," Erik said, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place in his mind. "Oh, but I am," Grim replied, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace. "I'm just not only a slave trader. Tell me, Erik the Fierce, do you recognize the name Grim the Black?" The name hit Erik like an avalanche of unwelcome memories. Grim the Black, assassin, mercenary, and one of the most feared killers in the Eastern lands. A man who commanded prices that rivaled the annual income of small kingdoms, whose services were sought by those who needed enemies to disappear permanently and completely. "That's impossible," Erik said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were false. The pieces all fit. The careful planning, the professional approach, the way Grim had used his companions as a test rather than genuine support. "What would someone like you be doing in the slave trade?" "Even legendary assassins need to eat," Grim said, drawing his curved eastern blade with the casual ease of long practice. "But in this case, the slave trade was merely a convenient cover for my real business here. You see, Erik the Fierce, someone has put a very large price on your head." The revelation staggered Erik more than any physical blow could have. For 3 years, he had lived in peaceful obscurity, believing that his past was buried along with the men he had killed and the battles he had won. The idea that someone had not only discovered his location, but cared enough to hire an assassin of Grim's caliber suggested enemies with very long memories and very deep pockets. "Who?" Erik asked, his mind racing through possibilities even as he adjusted his stance to face this new and far more dangerous opponent. "Does it matter?" Grim replied, beginning to circle with the predatory patience of a wolf selecting the perfect moment to strike. "The contract specifies that your death appear accidental, or at least untraceable, to the person who hired me. An unfortunate encounter with slave traders while defending a rescued woman seemed perfect, heroic even. Your reputation would remain intact, while you would be permanently removed from whatever game board you've unknowingly occupied." Alva's sharp intake of breath reminded Erik that she was still present, still in danger, and now facing a threat far beyond anything they had anticipated. Grim the Black was not the sort of enemy who left loose ends or witnesses. "Let her go," Erik said, keeping his eyes fixed on Grim, while peripherally tracking the movements of the wounded but not dead brothers. "Your contract is with me, not her." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong," Grim said, his smile growing wider. "You see, the woman was never really the slave of those men I hired. She's been working for me from the beginning. A very talented actress who specializes in playing the victim in order to get close to specific targets." The words hit Alva like a physical blow. Erik could see her face go white with shock and something that might have been fury. "That's not true," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "isn't it?" Grim asked, turning his attention to her with predatory interest. "Tell me, my dear, how exactly did you know those chains were weak at just the right point? How did you know my men were approaching long before anyone else could hear them? How convenient that you led Erik the Fierce to exactly the right emotional state to make him willing to fight impossible odds to defend you." Erik felt the world shifting beneath his feet as doubt crept into his mind like poison. The questions Grim raised were legitimate. Alva had demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that seemed inconsistent with years of helpless captivity. Her survival instincts were too sharp, her awareness too acute, her recovery too rapid for someone who had been broken by prolonged abuse. But even as these doubts multiplied in his mind, Erik looked at Alva's face and saw something that no amount of acting could fake: genuine horror at Grim's implications, and beneath that, a pain so deep it seemed to reach her very soul. "She's not working for you," Erik said with absolute certainty. "How can you be so sure?" Grim asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Because," Erik replied, raising his sword to guard position as he prepared for the fight of his life. "I've seen enough real pain to recognize it when I encounter it. And I've seen enough lies to know the difference." Grim's laugh was like breaking glass. "We'll see about that. But first, Let me show you why they call me the Black." The assassin's blade moved like striking lightning, and suddenly Erik was fighting for his life against an opponent whose skill matched his own, and whose motivation was unclouded by conscience or mercy. This was not the honorable combat of the battlefield, or even the brutal pragmatism of warfare. This was murder disguised as artistry, and Erik was about to discover whether 3 years of peaceful farming had cost him the edge that had once made him legendary. The clash of steel on steel rang across the clearing like a bell tolling for the dead. Erik had faced many skilled opponents in his years of warfare, but Grim the Black fought with a precision that bordered on supernatural. Every attack flowed seamlessly into the next. Every defense created opportunities for counterattack, and every movement served multiple purposes in a deadly chess game where the stakes were measured in blood. Within the first exchange of blows, Erik understood that this would not be a battle he could win through superior strength or conventional tactics. Grim was his equal in skill, his superior in pure technique, and unburdened by the 3 years of peaceful farming that had softened Erik's edge. Worse still, the assassin fought with the cold calculation of someone who killed for profit rather than passion. Every strike was economical, every defense efficient, every movement designed to conserve energy for the long fight ahead. Erik gave ground steadily, using the terrain around his longhouse to break up Grim's rhythm and create opportunities for unconventional attacks. A low stone wall became an obstacle to force Grim to adjust his footing. A scatter of farming tools offered potential improvised weapons. The elevated doorway to his home created height advantages that could be exploited if he could maneuver his opponent into the right position. But for every advantage Erik created, Grim seemed to counter with tactical awareness that matched his own. When Erik tried to use the stone wall to limit the assassin's movement, Grim vaulted it with fluid grace and pressed his attack before Erik could adjust. When Erik grabbed a hayfork to extend his reach, Grim's curved blade carved through the wooden handle like it was made of parchment. "You're better than I expected," Grim said conversationally as their blades locked at the crossguard, neither man able to gain immediate advantage. "The stories claimed you were good, but stories often exaggerate." "You're not exaggerated." "Neither are you," Erik replied, twisting away from the bind and launching a series of cuts that would have dismembered a lesser opponent. Grim flowed around them like water, his curved blade describing intricate patterns that turned aside Erik's attacks while creating openings for devastating ripostes. Behind them, Alva had taken shelter behind the stone wall, but Erik could feel her eyes on the combat, tracking every exchange with an intensity that spoke of more than casual interest. During a brief lull as both fighters circled each other, seeking advantage, she called out with desperate urgency, "Erik, he's not trying to kill you quickly. He's studying you, learning your patterns." The observation struck home like a physical blow because Erik realized she was absolutely right. Despite his superior technique, Grim was deliberately prolonging the fight, testing different approaches, cataloging Erik's responses and preferences. This was not a battle, but a vivisection. Grim was taking Erik apart piece by piece, learning everything there was to know about his fighting style before delivering the killing stroke. Very perceptive. Grim called to Alva without taking his eyes off Erik. "I'm impressed by your tactical awareness. Perhaps there's more to you than even I was told." "What were you told?" Alva demanded, her voice carrying an edge that made both fighters pause momentarily. "That you were the perfect bait," Grim replied, resuming his circling movement around Erik. "A broken slave who would inspire exactly the kind of protective instincts that would make a retired warrior abandon caution for conscience. Someone whose suffering would be so authentic that even Erik the Fierce wouldn't question the coincidence of finding you exactly where my contract required him to be." Erik felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting again in his mind. "You mean she wasn't working for you, but someone else arranged for her to be there when I found her?" "Precisely. Though I suspect our mutual employer didn't expect you to survive this encounter long enough to ask uncomfortable questions." Grim's blade flicked out in a testing strike that Erik barely managed to parry. "Whoever wants you dead has been planning this for a very long time." The implications were staggering. Someone had not only tracked Erik to his peaceful retirement, but had orchestrated an elaborate deception designed to exploit his character flaws, his inability to ignore suffering, his protective instincts, his tendency to act first and analyze later. Alva's presence, her chains, even the location where he had found her. All of it had been carefully arranged to create a scenario where Erik would voluntarily walk into a trap. But as this understanding crystallized in his mind, Erik also realized something else. If Alva had been placed as bait, then her suffering was real, even if her purpose had been manipulated. She was as much a victim of this conspiracy as he was, used and discarded by people who viewed human lives as game pieces to be moved around a board. "Who hired you?" Erik demanded, pressing his attack with renewed fury born of understanding. "Who wants me dead badly enough to orchestrate all this?" "Even if I knew," Grim replied, deflecting Erik's assault with infuriating ease, "professional ethics would prevent me from sharing that information. But I will tell you this, whoever it is has resources that extend far beyond what most people could imagine, and a patience that suggests this is not about recent grievances, but very old debts." The reference to old debts sent Erik's mind racing back through his years of warfare, cataloguing enemies who might have survived to nurse grudges and seek revenge. There had been so many battles, so many defeated opponents, so many widows and orphans left in the wake of his tactical genius. The list of people who might want him dead was longer than his arm and included everyone from rival commanders to the relatives of common soldiers whose deaths he had caused. But even as he pondered these possibilities, Erik's attention was divided between the intellectual puzzle and the immediate physical reality of fighting for his life against one of the most dangerous men alive. Grim's attacks were becoming more aggressive, his testing phase apparently complete, and Erik could feel his own endurance beginning to flag under the sustained assault. 3 years of farming had built different muscles than warfare required. His shoulders burned from the constant need to parry and riposte. His legs trembled from the rapid footwork needed to stay ahead of Grim's blade. And his sword arm was developing the telltale numbness that preceded complete failure. He was running out of time, and Grim knew it. "Feeling your age, Erik?" The assassin taunted as he pressed another flurry of attacks that drove Erik back toward the stone wall. 3 years of ploughing fields instead of ploughing through enemy ranks. "I wonder if you remember what it feels like to face someone who wants to kill you as much as you once wanted to kill others." The words were designed to distract and demoralize, but they had the opposite effect. Instead of undermining Erik's confidence, they reminded him of something important, something that had made him legendary during his years of warfare. Erik the Fierce had never been the strongest fighter or the fastest swordsman or the most technically perfect warrior. What had made him special was his ability to think tactically even in the midst of desperate combat, to find unconventional solutions when conventional ones would not suffice. "Alva," he called out during a brief respite as both fighters caught their breath. "The root cellar I mentioned. There's something hidden there, a wooden box wrapped in oiled leather. Can you reach it?" "What are you doing?" Grim asked, genuine curiosity mixing with wariness in his voice. "Changing the terms of engagement," Erik replied, his mind working furiously as he formulated a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. "You want to know why they called me the Fierce? It wasn't because I was the best fighter. There were always better fighters. It was because I was willing to do things that other people wouldn't consider." Alva had disappeared into the longhouse, and Erik could hear her moving around inside, presumably searching for the item he had requested. Grim glanced toward the building with obvious concern, clearly wondering what new variable was about to be introduced into their deadly equation. "What's in the box, Erik?" Grim asked, his casual confidence beginning to show the first cracks. Insurance, Erik replied, settling into a defensive stance that would allow him to protect both himself and the longhouse entrance. Something I hoped never to use again, but kept anyway because old habits die. Hard. The sound of splintering wood from inside the longhouse suggested that Alva had found the hidden compartment Erik had built into the root cellar. Years ago, a secret cache that contained items he had hoped never to need again, but couldn't bring himself to destroy completely. Items that represented the darkest aspects of his former profession. The tools and techniques that separated true warriors from mere fighters. When Alva emerged from the longhouse, she carried a small wooden box that seemed to pulse with malevolent potential despite its innocuous appearance. Even Grim, for all his professional composure, took an involuntary step backward as she approached. "What is that?" the assassin demanded. Erik's smile was sharp as a blade's edge and twice as dangerous. "That," he said, "is why smart enemies hired assassins to kill me from a distance instead of facing me directly, and why you should have taken your employer's money and walked away instead of trying to earn a reputation by killing Erik the Fierce in single combat." The box contained Greek fire, the legendary incendiary mixture that had made the Byzantine Empire's navy so feared throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Erik had acquired several vials of the substance during his campaigns and kept them as insurance against threats that conventional weapons could not address. The liquid burned with supernatural intensity, could not be extinguished by water, and turned any battlefield into a literal hellscape where survival depended more on luck than skill. "You're bluffing," Grim said, but his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "Am I?" Erik asked, accepting the box from Alva with hands that were steady despite the exhaustion that racked his body. "Are you willing to bet your life that Erik the Fierce wouldn't burn down his own farm to kill an enemy? Because I assure you, Grim the Black, there are things I value more than property, and some victories are worth any price." The Greek fire changed everything. Grim's confident smile disappeared entirely as Erik opened the wooden box to reveal 3 ceramic vials nestled in straw, each one containing enough incendiary liquid to turn the entire clearing into a blazing inferno. The legendary assassin had faced many dangerous opponents, but few had been willing to risk mutual destruction to ensure victory. "You're insane," Grim said, genuine respect mixing with wariness in his voice. "You'd burn everything, your home, your land, yourself, just to kill me?" "I've lost everything before," Erik replied calmly, lifting one of the vials with steady hands. "Homes can be rebuilt, land can be reclaimed, but some enemies need to be stopped permanently, regardless of the cost." The threat was not an empty one, and everyone present knew it. Greek fire was notorious for its unpredictability. Once ignited, it could spread faster than a man could run, burning with such intensity that it melted metal and consumed stone. Using it in close quarters was tantamount to suicide. But it was also the one weapon that could neutralize even the most skilled opponent through sheer destructive force. Alva watched this deadly chess match with fascination and growing understanding. She had seen Erik the farmer, gentle, patient, dedicated to peaceful pursuits. She had glimpsed Erik the warrior, skilled, disciplined, capable of precise violence when necessary. But now she was witnessing something else entirely. Erik the tactician, the man who had earned his fearsome reputation not through superior swordsmanship, but through his willingness to think beyond conventional limitations. "There's still time to walk away," Erik offered, though his grip on the vial remained firm. "Take your surviving men and leave. Tell whoever hired you that Erik the Fierce was dead when you arrived, killed by bandits, wild animals, whatever story serves your purposes. Collect your payment and find a new profession." Grim considered this proposal with the careful calculation of a professional evaluating risk versus reward. His contract specified that Erik's death should appear accidental, and a farmstead destroyed by fire with its owner's burned remains inside would certainly meet that requirement. But the uncertainty lay in whether both of them would survive the conflagration long enough for Grim to escape and claim his payment. An interesting proposition, the assassin mused. His blade still ready but no longer actively threatening. But you're overlooking a crucial detail. If I return to my employer claiming you're dead without proof, and you subsequently resurface somewhere else, my professional reputation would be destroyed. In my line of work, reputation is everything. Then we have a problem, Erik said, his thumb moving to the cork that sealed the vial. Because I'm not planning to die today, accidentally or otherwise. The standoff stretched between them, like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. 3 years of peace had not dulled Erik's understanding of tactical psychology. He could see the calculations running behind Grimm's eyes, weighing the certainty of mutual destruction against the possibility of victory through conventional means. The assassin was trapped between professional obligations and survival instincts, and Erik was exploiting that tension with ruthless efficiency. But even as he maintained the threatening posture, Erik's mind was working on multiple levels, analyzing the situation for weaknesses and opportunities that didn't require mutual annihilation. The Greek fire was effective precisely because of its finality. Once used, there would be no second chances, no opportunity to correct mistakes or adjust tactics. It was a weapon of absolute last resort, and Erik preferred to reserve absolute measures for absolutely hopeless situations. There is another option, Alva said quietly, speaking for the first time since retrieving the box from the root cellar. Both men turned toward her with expressions of surprise. Throughout the confrontation, she had remained silent, apparently content to let Erik handle the tactical decisions. But now she stepped forward with the same careful deliberation she had shown when throwing stones to aid Erik's earlier fight. What option? Grimm asked, genuine curiosity overcoming his wariness. You could kill me instead, Alva said simply. Your employer wanted Erik dead because of something he did in the past, something that made him dangerous to them. But if I were to die dramatically while under his protection, especially if it appeared that his attempts to save me had failed, Erik the Fierce would be destroyed, just as effectively as if you had put a sword through his heart. The proposal hit Erik like a physical blow. The tactical brilliance of it was undeniable. Psychological warfare often proved more effective than physical violence, and the guilt of failing to protect someone under his care would indeed cripple him more thoroughly than any injury. But the casual way Alva offered her own life as a solution to their tactical problem spoke to a level of self-sacrifice that took his breath away. No, Erik said flatly. That's not happening. It makes sense, Alva continued, her voice growing stronger as she developed the idea. Grimm could claim that you were killed trying to prevent my death, heroic but ultimately futile. The story would satisfy his employer's need for revenge, while preserving his professional reputation. Everyone gets what they want except for me, and I've been dead inside for so long that the physical reality would just make it official. Grimm tilted his head thoughtfully, clearly intrigued by the unexpected proposal. It has merit, he admitted. The psychological destruction angle hadn't occurred to me. But you're right. There are forms of victory that don't require the target's physical death. Absolutely not, Erik repeated, his grip tightening on the Greek fire vial. I didn't break your chains just to watch you sacrifice yourself for my sake, but you'd sacrifice yourself for mine. Alva asked, gesturing toward the incendiary weapon in his hand. How is what you're planning any different? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, forcing Erik to confront the fundamental contradiction in his position. He was indeed prepared to sacrifice himself to ensure Alva's freedom, yet he refused to consider her making the same choice for his sake. The asymmetry revealed something about his own assumptions that he had never examined, the unconscious belief that his life was somehow less valuable than hers, that protection was something that flowed in only one direction. It's different because, Erik began, then stopped as he realized he had no logical completion for that sentence. Because I'm a woman, Alva asked. Because I was a slave? Because you've decided that your guilt over past battles makes your life worth less than mine. Each question struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. Erik had indeed been operating under assumptions that seemed reasonable until they were spoken aloud. His years of warfare had taught him to think of himself as expendable, a weapon to be used and discarded in service of larger purposes. The transition to peaceful farming had not changed that fundamental self-assessment. He had simply redirected his protective instincts toward his crops and livestock rather than his commanders and comrades. Because, Erik said finally, I chose this fight. You were dragged into it against your will. Was I? Alva asked, and something in her tone made both men look at her more carefully. Grim is right about one thing. My presence here wasn't accidental. Someone arranged for you to find me exactly when and where you did. But that doesn't mean I'm an unwilling participant in what comes next. Grim had been following this exchange with professional interest, but now his attention sharpened. What exactly are you saying? Alva smiled, and for the first time since Erik had found her chained in the marsh, the expression reached her eyes. I'm saying that your employer made a crucial error in their planning. They assumed that a broken slave would remain broken, that years of conditioning would prevent me from acting independently when the moment came. They were wrong. She reached into the folds of her damaged dress and withdrew something that made Grim curse violently and Erik's eyes widen in shock. A small glass vial, identical to those in the wooden box, containing the same deadly Greek fire that had changed the tactical balance only moments before. I took this from your cache while I was retrieving the box, Alva explained calmly. Insurance, you might say, because I've learned that survival often depends on having options that other people don't know about. The revelation transformed the standoff completely. Instead of one man with a weapon of mutual destruction facing a skilled assassin, there were now two people with the means to turn the entire clearing into an inferno. Grim found himself outnumbered and outgunned by opponents who seemed increasingly willing to embrace extreme solutions. You can't be serious, the assassin said, though his voice lacked conviction. You'd burn yourself alive just to deny me a successful contract. I've been dead for years, Alva replied matter-of-factly. The only question is whether my death serves any purpose beyond satisfying your employer's need for revenge. And I've decided that it will, by ensuring that their carefully laid plans fail completely. Erik stared at this woman who had transformed before his eyes, from victim to ally to tactical equal. The chains were broken, but it was only now that he truly understood the spirit they had been meant to contain. Alva had not simply endured her captivity, she had studied it, learned from it, and emerged with the understanding of power dynamics that made her dangerous in ways her captors had never anticipated. There's a third option, Erik said suddenly, inspiration striking like lightning. One that doesn't require anyone to die. Both Alva and Grim turned toward him with expressions of skepticism. They had been caught up in the logic of mutual destruction, the tactical mathematics of who could inflict the most damage on whom. But Erik's mind was working on a different level, seeing possibilities that lay outside the framework of conventional warfare. Your employer wants Erik the Fierce dead, he continued, his voice gaining strength as the plan crystallized in his mind. But what if Erik the Fierce really did die today? What if both of us disappeared completely, leaving behind only a burned farmstead and no bodies to prove what actually happened? Grim's eyes narrowed as he began to follow Erik's reasoning. You're suggesting we fake your deaths. I'm suggesting we give everyone what they want while keeping what we need, Erik corrected. Your employer gets confirmation that their enemy is eliminated. You get to maintain your professional reputation. Alva gets her freedom, and I get to start over somewhere else with someone who understands what it means to fight for something worth defending. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Greek fire would indeed consume the farmstead, but Erik and Alva would already be gone, escaped into the deep forest, while Grim told his employer that both targets had been eliminated in the conflagration. It would require precise timing, mutual trust, and a willingness to abandon everything Erik had built during his 3 years of peace. But as he looked at Alva, this remarkable woman who had been through hell and emerged with her capacity for tactical thinking intact, Erik realized that some things were worth any sacrifice. His peaceful farm could be rebuilt anywhere. His quiet life could be reconstructed in any location. But the opportunity to build something meaningful with someone who truly understood the cost of survival, that was irreplaceable. "What do you say, Grim?" Erik asked, his thumb still poised over the cork of his Greek fire vial. "Are you interested in a solution where everyone walks away alive?" 6 months later, the merchant ship Wanderer's Hope pulled into the harbor at Hedeby, its holds full of amber and furs from the northern reaches. Among the passengers who disembarked were a man and woman, who drew little attention from the busy dock workers, just another couple seeking their fortune in the bustling trade center that connected the Norse world to the broader commerce of Europe. The man was tall and bearded, with the calloused hands of someone accustomed to hard work. His companion was equally practical in appearance, her dark hair braided simply, and her clothes chosen for durability rather than fashion. To casual observers, they appeared to be successful but unremarkable traders, perhaps specialists in some particular commodity that had brought them prosperity without making them wealthy enough to attract unwanted attention. They had arrived in Hedeby as Bjorn and Sigrid Eriksson, complete with carefully crafted histories and documentation that would satisfy any reasonable inquiry. Bjorn was a fur trader from the far north who had married Sigrid after she had been freed from slavery by a generous jarl. They were looking to establish themselves in Hedeby's thriving market, perhaps open a modest trading house that would allow them to build a quiet but comfortable life. The reality, of course, was considerably more complex. The plan to fake their deaths had worked flawlessly, aided by Grim's professional competence and genuine desire to avoid mutual destruction. The farmstead had burned spectacularly, consuming everything Erik had built during his 3 years of peace. Grim had returned to his employer with charred remains, animal bones that would pass casual inspection, and a story of successful assassination that satisfied all contractual obligations. More importantly, the network of contacts that had tracked Erik to his retirement had lost the trail completely. As far as anyone knew, Erik the Fierce had died in a fire while defending a rescued slave woman, a heroic end that burnished his legend while removing him permanently from whatever game board his unknown enemies had been playing. The transition to their new identities had not been without challenges. Both Erik and Alva carried psychological scars that made trust difficult, and learning to function as partners rather than protector and protected required patience from both sides. There had been moments of tension, arguments over decisions that seemed simple but carried deeper implications about autonomy and control. But gradually they had found a rhythm that worked for both of them. Erik's tactical mind and hard-won experience in surviving dangerous situations complemented Alva's sharp intelligence and deep understanding of how people could be manipulated and controlled. Together, they made a formidable team, not just as merchants, but as two people who had learned to recognize each other's strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. Their trading business was genuinely profitable, built on Erik's knowledge of northern hunting grounds and Alva's unexpected expertise in evaluating the quality of textiles and craftwork. But more than commercial success, they had found something that neither had possessed before: a partnership based on mutual respect rather than obligation or desperation. Erik had discovered that protecting someone did not require him to make all the decisions or bear all the risks. Alva had learned that accepting help did not make her weak or dependent, that strength could be shared rather than hoarded. Together, they had built something that was stronger than either could have achieved alone. The transformation was most visible in small moments. The way Alva no longer flinched when Erik moved suddenly, The way Erik consulted her opinion before making important decisions. The way they had learned to read each other's moods and provide support without being asked. The way they had both discovered that trust, once carefully built, became the foundation for everything else. On this particular evening, as they settled into their modest lodgings above a tavern that catered to traveling merchants, Alva was examining a piece of silverwork that a craftsman had offered for their consideration. Her fingers moved over the intricate designs with the practiced touch of someone who had learned to detect quality through careful examination. "This is genuine Byzantine work," she said, holding the piece up to catch the lamplight. "The hallmarks are correct, and the technique is too sophisticated to be a copy. We could get 3 times what he's asking for it in the Western markets." Erik nodded, but his attention was focused more on watching Alva work than on the commercial opportunity she had identified. 6 months ago, she had been a broken woman chained in a marsh, abandoned to die by people who viewed her as property. Now she was a shrewd trader with an eye for quality and a mind that could calculate profit margins as easily as she once calculated survival odds. "What are you thinking about?" Alva asked, noticing his distracted expression. "About how far we've both come," Erik replied honestly. 6 months ago I thought I was rescuing you. I didn't realize you were rescuing me right back." Alva smiled, the real smile that had become more frequent as the months passed and safety transformed from a desperate hope into a lived reality. "Mutual rescue," she said. "I like that better than either of us being saved by the other." Through the window of their room, the lights of Hedeby's harbor twinkled like stars reflected in dark water. Ships from a dozen nations rode at anchor, their crews speaking languages from across the known world. It was a place where people could reinvent themselves, where the past mattered less than present capabilities, where 2 people with complicated histories could build something entirely new. Erik reached for Alva's hand, still marveling at how natural the gesture had become. Her fingers intertwined with his without hesitation, a small miracle that represented the larger miracle of learning to trust again after betrayal, of finding hope after despair, of discovering that freedom was not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choices freely made. "What's next for Bjorn and Sigrid Eriksson?" Alva asked, settling comfortably against his shoulder. "Whatever we decide," Erik replied. "That's the beauty of starting over. We get to choose who we become." Outside, the harbor bells chimed the evening hour, marking the end of another day in their new lives. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new challenges, new choices to make together. But tonight, in the quiet comfort of their shared space, 2 people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances could simply enjoy the extraordinary, ordinary pleasure of planning a future they would build side by side.